Transportation is the biggest source of carbon emissions. And of course, tourism and business travel are a big part of that.
Are there options for shrinking their carbon footprint?
We'll start that conversation on this episode of the Growth Busters podcast.
Calling. Call the Growth Busters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Really excited to be talking in this episode with Dr. Michael Hall, professor in the Department of Management, Marketing, and Entrepreneurship at University of Canterbury in New Zealand. I've shortened the list of credentials, which are really impressive, Michael. Co-editor, Current Issues in Tourism, Associate Editor of Tourism Geographies, Editor of the Contemporary Geographies of Leisure, Tourism, and Mobility book series, co-editor of the Aspects of Tourism book series, editor of Routledge Studies of Gastronomy, Food, and Drink. I like the sound of that one. Co-editor of Routledge Critical Studies in Tourism, Business, and Management, co-author of the book Tourism, Public Transport, and Sustainable Mobility. The guy clearly doesn't have any time to take off and actually be a tourist, I don't think. We'll have to talk about that. But anyway, Michael, thanks a lot for joining us for this fascinating entree into the subject of travel.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's kind of start with the big picture. Easy question, really. What's the relevance of travel and tourism to sustainability?
Well, it's always having that kind of conversation when we're in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, because that's changing the whole ballgame. But in general, you'd argue that travel and tourism contributes about 8% to global emissions in a normal year, with that potentially actually even being higher, depending how you calculate it. You have, for example, the UN World Tourism Organization. They would argue it's around 5%. In really good independent studies done out of Queensland and the States a couple of years ago, they came up with a figure about 8%. If you also factor in what's called radiative forcing, though, which essentially, think of the clouds you see when the planes go flying, then it may even be up to 10, 12% contribution. So it's like all these things, depends how you calculate it. In one sense, whatever way you work it, it's big. And if tourism was a country, it's probably be about the fourth biggest emitter, something like that. So it's pretty substantial.
Now, are you including business travel in this or excluding business travel?
We're including everything into that.
So it's not insignificant. If we talked about transportation in general, that's huge. So much of transportation is just all the crap that we insist on sending back and forth around the world in our overconsumptive lifestyles, huh?
It's an interesting one, though, because at the same time, we can't get away from using transport. We can't get away from being mobile. And there's, I think, some really interesting tensions between how do you do that sustainably. I think the trade-off there, if we're dealing with people, and in fact, even if we're dealing with goods, it's how far things go and how fast they go. I mean, if you're looking for some bottom lines there, that's their key things to be thinking about. How fast does it go? How far does it go? And what trade-offs can you actually have in doing that? One of the really interesting things which has occurred in some countries, Australia and New Zealand would be some of those countries, is that with the impact of COVID-19, a lot of suppliers who export or import have suddenly found the cost of everything going up, because often what was happening, even things like, bizarrely, vegetables and salads, which are being exported, for example, from New Zealand to Singapore now are far too expensive to send there because they were just taking up excess space in the plane. Honestly, there's all kinds of really interesting combinations in terms of how this stuff works. It's messy. Would be the policy way of describing it. It's messy.
I'm guessing that most of the projections and predictions of the last few years are, we might talk about them a little bit, but they're all being adjusted now because COVID is interrupting that. Do you think that's going to be a long-term shift, or do you think before long we'll kind of be back on the track we were on?
That's a really interesting question, and one which myself and other colleagues are mulling over at the moment. I think you have lots of people who are interested in degrowth and sustainability who hope it could be a transformative moment. If I'm in one of my optimistic moods, I'd be one of those people. However, here's the but in all of this. I'm not quite convinced it's going to be the case, because one of the things that we tend to see in situations like this is the hit on the economy. And depending where you are in the world and your health systems, welfare systems, people have to work. And many governments, in order to meet that, are saying, okay, we have to get back to business. And unfortunately, it's business as normal, or in some cases, even worse, in terms of saying, for example, we're going to help out the airlines, but we're not going to have any conditions whatsoever in terms of how green you become. And they're the kinds of issues which are happening. So, for example, we think of Sicily in Italy. At the moment, Sicily has a provincial government program which essentially will pay half of your holiday. And there's other countries and destinations which are doing the same. While you have some destinations saying we're going to try and be more sustainable, you have others which are going to say race to the bottom, we're going to be cheap, we just want people here. I'm not really sure how some of those destinations which want to be more sustainable can match that. If you're then looking at the employment dynamics and all those sorts of things. So, it is a really complex and messy situation. My own feeling, to be quite honest, is that, yes, there is going to be a hit to travel and tourism, international travel and tourism for the next 3-4 years. But I have a really bad feeling it may well go back to pretty much normal after that. I'm always amazed at the capacity of capital and capitalism to rebound. And I think we're going to see that again. I don't want to see that again, but I think that's what we're going to have. To be honest, I actually think we're in danger of almost hastening the race to get to some tipping points that we don't want to get to because of the current situation. I hate to be a naysayer, but that really is the way I'm looking at it at the moment.
Well, I think the one thing, and because this is probably a pretty small thing, when you have gotten invitations to be a speaker at conferences, and I'm assuming that was before this COVID thing, that you would frequently ask if you could speak from, home or your office and not travel there, and that they were frequently not too crazy about that idea. But now, obviously, conferences are having to reinvent themselves and go online, and businesses are finding all kinds of great cost savings and some other advantages of staying off of the airplanes and doing a lot more online. You don't think that might be one sticky thing because it'll save so much money, and nobody wants to get on an airplane anymore. So, none of the traveling salespeople want to fly every week.
I think it will stick to a bit, but only a bit. And I think the problem that I see there is in terms of business travel is that sometimes getting on a plane and going somewhere is a sign of commitment. And in some business cultures, you also have to sit down and have a meal together, have a drink together. And I think that's very hard to get away from. I think you can have conversations like this one online, but that almost at times comes after. The big problem is, from a business sense, is that how do you build trust online? And that is the real challenge. I think it can be done, but I don't think business travel or even conference travel is ever going to be completely replaced. At times, you do really have to try and meet face to face. Now, in saying that, ideally we want to be returned back to where we were before, but I think there are ways in which you can have more sustainable business travel practices, either by frankly charging people more to travel and actually paying the cost of their emissions and their pollution, which would be a really good start, but also seeing it as part of a bigger communication mix. So I think that many businesses, can reduce their travel bills by doing online communication, but there's still going to be some degree of business travel. And I think it's not just business. The one that has always fascinated me is VFR travel, visiting friends and relations, diaspora travel, the fact that you have families somewhere else. And, because the world has become so much more global, as it were, the last 40, 50 years, so many of us have family, friends, relations, different parts of the world. It's one of those paradoxes, I think, because the more mobile you've become, the more mobile you need to continue to be to maintain those social relations and meet people and, deal with family. So I think that's a real challenge. And how we overcome that, I think, is really tough. I sometimes used to talk about mother guilt. That notion that you had to be home for Thanksgiving or you had to be home for Christmas, that kind of thing. I think it's true. I mean, look, my parents have now passed on, but I think that's really true. And it's why those times of the year are peak travel times. Or in some other cultures, it's Easter, that kind of thing. And that's really hard to overcome. And I kind of think, well, fine. But if you do have to travel, then, pay for it, basically, and pay the real cost of travel. I think those kind of things are just really, really hard to change. We may be able to change a little bit where people go traveling to. That will take time because you have people, holiday makers, for example, with the industry focuses on the exotic. And what I find fascinating is that when you look at travel data for the last 20, 30 years, it's like long distance travel data. People who can afford to, they travel further each year and they tend to travel more often. So you have a small bunch of people with, it's not my term, but they have a hyper-mobile lifestyle, and that's what they do. Some of it's business people, some of it's leisure, and often that's tied in both to business status and also personal status. I travel, therefore I am kind of thing. So you have that kind of thing. And those kinds of practices, I think it is really, really hard to change. In a lot of the research I do, we have these kinds of conversations, I say that the stuff that's difficult to change isn't the stuff we're really conscious about. It's the stuff that's a habit. Most of our consumption is habit, and it includes lots of travel and tourism. We just do it without thinking. That's the stuff that's really hard to change.
And also what travel means to so many people across the world. I don't travel much. I've never really been anywhere. But I mean, I've met a number of people who have traveled from all over Europe, Australia, all over the States, and they love California. They love being here. And I always ask them all, where's your favorite place? You guys are, traveling all around the world. Where's your favorite place to go? And, most of them will say someplace in California, which has been good for me because I haven't been motivated to really leave. But at the same time, I think travel for a lot of people, it's an opportunity to experience and learn about a different culture or see a new place. And that is so hard to kind of envision a future where you're no longer able to do that. And I know people who have given up travel and instead they engage more with their communities and make an active effort to experience different cultures in their community. We have Los Angeles, for example, we have Koreatown and we have different communities and it's very diverse. So you could experience a whole number of different cultures in one location. But I guess in addition to that, also students that are wanting to travel and experience a different country where they're doing their undergraduate or graduate studies, that has a lot of positive impacts as well. So,
yeah, I would agree with that. Which is really interesting because I'm not sure you really have to. I mean, the problem with our travel and emissions and its impacts isn't so much traveling per se. It's how often you travel, how far you travel, and how you travel. You can envisage taking more trips, for example, which are more local and having less emissions and having less impact, potentially. I think it's how you conceive it. And even some of that long distance, almost slow travel, particularly if you can go by ship rather than plane. But, if you have that longer term travel, that isn't necessarily as bad as taking lots of frequent jet flights. If you're in California, fly down to New Zealand or Australia, do the 6-month backpacking holiday or, go pick grapes or fruit or whatever. Lots of people do, or come study. You're actually extending out your emissions per day. In one sense, you're potentially lowering your impact, especially if you're offsetting as well, which you can be doing. So that kind of travel isn't necessarily the biggest problem. The biggest problem are go back to those business travelers, is the hypermobile who travel so much. They're the biggest problem, people with their private jet planes. I think it's how you travel. Like, it's really interesting in Europe at the moment, you're seeing a real comeback for the overnight trains. You actually do a long distance train ride and you do it as an overnight sleeper. And the sort of sleeper trains, are good quality sleeper trains, are making a comeback. And you're now getting all that connectivity in Europe. Of course, you need to have the railway lines and the companies and the regulation in place to enable that. But clearly that's happening in Europe. And it also then depends on what's being sold people. I think for some people, actually the opportunity to go on an overnight sleeper train is actually quite exciting, potentially. It's what people are getting excited by. I struggle sometimes about the different types of tourism. I think some of the things talking about like backpacking, that student tourism, that is part of cultural contact, understanding the world, and it can be relatively low emissions, relatively, okay? It's those people who are flying down to the Caribbean or flying to a resort, and what they're doing for their holiday is basically interchangeable with lots of other places. They're just being snowbirds kind of thing. That's the interesting challenge to me, is that is the type of travel which is more substitutable. Now, even then, I'm not necessarily saying don't travel. For those, I tend to advocate as part of a transition, because it will take time to do this, you should be paying for your emissions. You should be covering the real costs of travel and the real costs of our environmental and other impacts. And that isn't really happening. It's done voluntary. So unless you're dealing with a really narrow group of eco-tourists, not genuine eco-travelers, you're basically dealing with people who need to be paying more. And offsetting. And offsetting is not everything. Ultimately, we need to reduce how much we travel, or really consciously think about traveling with low emissions, low energy travel, which can be done. But, some countries can do that better than others. I mean, look, having been to the States, I'm more of an Oregon guy. I've got really good friends in Oregon. Getting around by train and by public transport as a tourist is pain in the ass. That's the only way I can describe it. And it's awful.
Yeah, it is hard.
I teach in Europe and I do offset. I always have to say that before that I go. I can go everywhere by train. I go all around Sweden by train. I go around Germany by train. You can do that. If I'm in the States, it is really hard to do, if not impossible.
Yeah.
The best I've been able to do is go down from Vancouver down to Klamath Falls. But, okay, then going out of that line using public transport is really hard. That is part of the overall equation about making travel and tourism more sustainable. You have to have that system in place. And what I find really interesting is that some parts of the world, parts of Scotland, Finland, other areas as well, it is actually the tourists which help subsidize the public transport. If you think of some more remote areas, the islands off the west coast of Scotland, for example, they're pretty remote, but people go there for summer. Okay, so you've got summer traffic. That can help subsidize that service to also go over winter for the local people, for those kind of ferry services. So you can have real win-win situations by using tourists to actually support your local public transport infrastructure. So much of the work I'm interested in is not advocating for tourism per se, but saying, okay, how can we use tourism and how can we use visitors to support a more sustainable community? And see, how do we create those win-win type situations? And I think as part of that, we need to see the complete picture of people's mobility. How do people get there? How far do they go? Why do they go there? And I think that is a really interesting issue for some locations. I mentioned the Caribbean earlier as a substitutable destination in some cases. But we have a reality in which there are some island states in the Pacific and the Caribbean and elsewhere that become so hyper-dependent on tourism for economic well-being. For those kinds of places, how do we enable them to transition? So it's not just the consumers that need to transition, it's also the destinations and the locations and what they provide in thinking about a more sustainable future. But, being able to integrate all this stuff together. Interesting comment to make, because what we're having now, in terms of my teaching during COVID-19, is the classic problem, actually, of being able to substitute being online for face-to-face contact. Because the reality is, you can do it for small groups, but you have moments where, the system doesn't work very well. And ironically, we're living in countries which have, by international standards, pretty good networks, etc. Imagine being in those countries and those locations. What can they do in terms of substitution? The limits of substitutability for some of these things. Obviously, I'm not advocating that we don't try and substitute. I do. But there are technological and other barriers to doing it.
Yeah, interesting. You brought up something a minute ago that I thought might be an interesting segue to a topic I definitely wanted to get into. You talked about the concern for these economies that are really dependent on tourism for jobs. And I'm not talking about Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I'm talking about people in other countries. And I know you've gotten into this a little bit. I'm a little bit perplexed about how tourism and travel really relates to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
You know, there are some locations which, particularly some of the island states, which in reality do not have many economic development possibilities. And for those countries, tourism is potentially still going to be part of the equation. But I think it's a case of not only going through what are the alternatives, and in many cases, the alternative may well be some form of fishing, but it has other issues in terms of control over fishing rights, etc. But it's also about how is local tourism designed? So maybe you can have less people, but actually make more money from them. I've always found this a really interesting issue. Everyone uses the term ecotourism, but when the term ecotourism was first developed back in the 80s and 90s, what it actually meant was limiting the number of people to a location because they wanted to see something in the environment, a species or a particular landscape, and being able to charge them more, therefore limiting the overall impact of tourism, but still receiving the economic benefits. And that's kind of been lost. We really need to come back and regain that for a lot of tourism locations, particularly which at a fair distance from their main source markets, because they're the ones which are going to be most affected by any carbon charging. So in those kind of places, what do? I think it's a case of trying to have a more premium product, but as part of that, also trying as much as possible to tie in what is in the accommodation and where people stay with local producers, what can be locally supplied. And one of my enormous frustrations when looking at this kind of stuff is the amount of island states which do not support their own local farmers. I just find it amazing. And having that local produce actually available in the hotel. I mean, I've had the experience of being in Fiji for some work stuff, and I was staying in a hotel, and breakfast was essentially all supplied from Australia because that's what the chef knew. And yet I could walk down the road, and I did walk down the road, 5-minute walk, go to the local market, and there's this amazing local tropical fruit for sale, really cheap. And I was trying to find out why the hell doesn't the hotel do that? And many hotels are like this. But if you can bring in that supply chain element, maximize the benefits of the tourism you have, which you may still have to have, then I think you can start to transition the economy. You'll never be completely away from tourism, but you can definitely have a much more sustainable tourism industry than what you had before. That is a real challenge for many of these countries. And it's for several reasons. It's because of the background of people who work in the hotels and their connectivity. It's also because you're often dealing with international chains and they have their particular way of thinking. And also, to be quite honest, sometimes they never even ask the guests what do they want. If you're going to, say, Jamaica or the Mauritius or somewhere like that, do you really want the same product as you get at home? Or can you have something different for the breakfast menu or lunch menu? And I think that's the kind of thing, that real nitty-gritty of trying to deal with sustainability in travel and tourism is just really thinking through, even though you're traveling internationally, how you can still reinforce the local in certain ways and value the local. But that is something which is hard to do and hard to get some businesses to think through.
The temptation is, and I think we've sort of just naturally gravitated toward thinking about air travel because it seems like that's the big boogeyman, in terms of climate impact. But is it? What are the various components of this subject area that you study so much of tourism and travel? What are the other components and what are the rough percentages of environmental impact?
It depends who you're looking at, but you usually say, without including radiative forcing, which is a bit messy, you're looking at probably 2 to 3% for aviation. Cruise ships are quite smaller, but cruise ships have a heck of a lot of local impact in terms of particulates and all other kinds of nasty things that come out. The cruise ship industry is trying to adapt, but it's like all these things, it's very slow. And also you have the problem with the cruise ship industry in terms of international waters. I mean, you know, I'll make myself deeply unpopular by saying this, but on a per passenger basis, I tend to find most of the cruise lines much more scary than aviation in some ways, because they have a wider range of impacts. And I'm not letting aviation off the hook. But I think the thing is with cruise ships, they're much more focused on particular locations and they have a different type of environmental impact, but it's still there and it's still a major issue which needs to be dealt with. But it's one of those things in terms of transitioning is what are the alternatives for those locations? I sometimes argue that the best form of tourism or the best form of sustainable tourism may well be no tourism at all. And I think that's probably true for some places. But you still have this issue of how do we provide employment? How do we generate employment? How do we help ensure a good standard of living? And that needs to become part of the destination development equation. But it often isn't, because often these things happen at a very, very piecemeal type basis in terms of being able to respond to those kinds of things.
I intended my question to be more broad and go beyond, how you get there.
Okay, so in terms of the actual destination, I think the accommodation side is really interesting in terms of measuring its impact. One of the things you're increasingly starting to see, but it depends what part of the world you're in, is much more focus on providing green accommodation as much as possible. In Sweden, there's a hotel chain, Nordic Choice, which has been really interesting in terms of some of their initiatives, as have a number of other Scandinavian hotel chains, in terms of local sourcing, organics. A couple of years ago, I was in Nordic Choice Hotel in Gothenburg in Sweden, and I went down to the breakfast buffet, and it was wonderful because you had staff wearing T-shirts saying to you, please only take what you need from the buffet, don't waste food. I thought that was fantastic.
Absolutely. And because you also control how much food you're taking, and it's not just, somebody else is serving you. So maybe you don't finish everything that they serve you or they prepare behind the kitchen. So yeah, buffet is a good way of monitoring how much you're consuming for sure.
It is, but I think with the buffet, you have to get people to be mindful of their consumption.
Because it seems like a good deal. It's like all you can eat.
If you think about it, it's like, I'm on holiday. I've paid for this. I'm going to pig out.
That's at your own risk because it's probably not going to be a fun time afterwards.
Probably not, but I think that happens quite a lot. And it's a case of being able to respond to that. I mean, it's interesting. A colleague and I have been doing work on sustainable restaurants the last few years. And one of the really interesting things there is looking at what can be done in terms of buffets. I mean, let's face it, they're really common in hotels. Okay, well, make sure you have more local produce for a start. Do you have more fruit? Don't have so much emphasis on meat. And you can do that kind of stuff. But one of the things that we've found in doing research on that is that the challenge isn't so much the property. The challenge is also the chefs and people who are back of house and what has their training been, which may sound silly. But okay, when they went through their training programs at college, were they being taught about food sustainability? Were they being taught about how much water goes in producing beef or that kind of stuff? If you're really looking to be serious about sustainability in travel and tourism and hospitality, we know that, like for restaurants, the biggest environmental impact is their supply chain by a long way. It's so huge. Where does their stuff come from? I find that fascinating because we have the shows on the Food Channel, that kind of thing, which kind of give the image of the chef going down to the farmer's market and buying in local. I mean, to be honest, that's crap because most restaurants, I'm not saying chefs don't do that. You will go down to do that. From my time in the industry, it's a case of you use the wholesaler. So therefore, hospitality wholesalers, what's their green program? Do they purchase local? I mean, California is kind of interesting here because in terms of farmers markets, it's one of the best places in the world in terms of farmers market legislation. So you know you're getting local stuff. But you need the whole system to make it work. And this is the challenge. It's really easy to take one piece out like aviation or cruise ships or restaurant. But we need to ask, how does it fit into that bigger picture of supply chain? And how does that contribute ultimately to sustainability? And they're the kind of questions we need to be asking and thinking about, in the case of hotels, where does the food come from? And I know that for me, for example, if I've been doing consultancy or lectures or whatever on this kind of stuff, I mean, I'm really passionate about local food no matter where I am. I'm someone who wants to eat locally, try the local cuisine. But many tourists actually don't. Many people, they are food neophobic. They do not want to try new things.
Yep, straight to McDonald's or Starbucks, right?
Absolutely. However, even in those cases, there isn't necessarily a problem. Yeah, it doesn't meet that romantic image, but do those other suppliers, if they also buy locally, then, okay, the fact the burger is still a burger and it's not exactly local, it still means that the potatoes, the onions, the fries, the meat or whatever kind of burger you're having, a veggie burger, it still came locally. So you've still been able to reduce emissions, reinforce the local, and reinforce sustainability. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need to get, is that I've been working this area for quite a long time now, and I get kind of frustrated that the focus is on ecotourism and on green tourism, which it goes out there and shouts about it. That's not the problem. The problem is all the other stuff that people do. We use the word mass tourism, that kind of stuff. That's the area we need to green. But it can be done in such a way it's not necessarily hugely in people's faces, and it doesn't necessarily change too much of the experience they're having and the fact they just want to go somewhere, have fun and have a holiday. But it means posing questions to organizations and the big chains about the realities of what they do in terms of buying local and reinforcing local and keeping emissions down, and what they do in terms of having like offsetting programs. And that then becomes the challenge you have.
So we're talking about greening tourism. Is all the low-hanging fruit or all the heavy lifting even, is it all at the industrial level, the system level, or does the individual consumer have a significant role to play in this?
I think both have a role. I think, and this is something which I tend to get pretty passionate about, is that there's a lot of focus on industry. And what industry will do is they're more than happy to become more efficient because they can then get better earnings. But the problem is, what's the rebound effect of that? Like, if you actually become more efficient, what do you do with the savings? If you pass them on to the customer, does it mean that you have more customers? If you put it into something else, where does that spend go? So efficiency is important, but it only gets us so far because the rebound effects come back and they take away in the long term your environmental savings.
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing.
Yeah, it's a real tricky thing.
Jevons paradox.
Yeah, Jevons paradox, and it's been around for such a long time, and I am constantly amazed at the government incapacity to recognize it. I really am. But I'm definitely not saying don't become more efficient, because we should. I think we need to deal with the other side of the equation. Some people call it degrowth. You can call it green consumption. I don't care what we call it, but it really is about having people thinking more about what they consume and being more conscious in their consumption where they can be. And that means having them think about the trade-offs, think about the real cost of travel and what they purchase. We have the so-called slow travel movement, which I think is significant, which is, go cycling, get on the bus, get on the train, get on a boat. But the reality is that's only a small number of people in percentage terms. The majority of people, that's not what they're after. It's those people we need to reach and get them thinking and changing. And that's why offsettings aren't perfect, but they are part of the transition to greener travel and a greener economy and a generally greener economy. But that means airlines or whoever it is in the tourism and travel industry actually putting in the charges for the real environmental cost of what we consume. And many airlines are not doing that. I mean, the thing which has always scared the hell out of me, and in fact, I usually put this as an extra assignment question in one of my classes, which is what would be the environmental impact of the currently unspent air miles around the world? Because if you think about it, it's frightening.
Yeah.
But the reality is that many airlines, the air miles program is one of the most profitable parts of the business. But all it's doing is making people consume more. The percentage of airlines which actually allow you to use those air miles or anything like that to offset your emissions is really low. To me, that's a bit of a win-win. But I don't think most airlines want to do it simply because, it's too profitable for them. The amount of airlines that make it easy to offset actually isn't very high. The current percentage of airlines which actually have offsetting programs is not even half. If you look at, say, all the international airline companies, it's not happening. And the onus keeps being put back onto the consumer, which is fine, but it's not being made easy for the consumer to offset. And to me, that's a major issue, which is really hard to respond to because it gets back to international legal conventions surrounding aviation and what can be charged for and what can't be charged for in terms of by nations. So, for example, when the EU tried to introduce an emissions tax on aviation several years ago, there was a huge backlash from airlines in the States, China, New Zealand as well. And in one sense, I found it all kind of ridiculous because we also know from some research that we had done about 4 years ago, some colleagues and I worked out that the average cost to offset your emissions from a tourist trip, and this is all tourist trips, international and domestic, was something like $11 American. And I think our international figure was something like, I think it was just over $30.
Yep.
It's nothing. But airlines are not willing to support having that put in place. And that really is a challenge. And obviously, we have a situation at the moment in which the airlines are being bailed out, and most countries are not putting in green conditions on those bailouts.
Of course not.
Going back to an earlier conversation, that's why I just think that eventually it'll go back to business as usual.
So you've talked about carbon offsets. How big a fan are you? There's some controversy about whether they're really useful or not.
I always say they're probably better than nothing. And I think they're part of a transition. Obviously, you want people to travel so fast and so far less. But I think as part of having people being conscious about their impact, I think it's valuable. I think that you can have some schemes which are very good and can help reduce emissions. So I think obviously the quality of the scheme is important, but they should be seen as part of a transition. I don't think they're necessarily an end in itself, but I think they should be part of the transition. The things we're talking about today, there's a bundle of things out there that we should be using, and their relative application will change from place to place and situation to situation. But I think they have to be part of the equation, at least for the next 20, 30 years, because it then gets back to the overall issue of how renewable is your energy anyway. So you have those kinds of questions. But as part of a transition, I think they're pretty important, actually.
Michael, I wanted to ask, I read an article a while back about concept of carbon trading, and I guess it kind of relates to offsetting emissions. I thought it was a pretty neat idea, just how we can maybe give everybody a set amount of travel emissions to use per year, for example. And if they exceed their allowed amount, maybe they purchase or trade with somebody else who has extra emissions if they don't drive or if they don't travel as much. Just kind of curious to hear what you think about that. I think obviously it has, benefits. And this is, I guess, an alternative to just adding a carbon tax for all travelers, because that would, have negative impacts for people who aren't able to afford to travel or pay that carbon tax. So that would prevent them from seeing their families, maybe even just once a year. So a carbon tax wouldn't negatively affect the rich from flying, but I guess I would fear something more of it affecting those unable to afford to travel.
Yeah, I think that's always the issue in terms of carbon taxes, is that those on lower incomes and how it affects them. That is a situation, unfortunately, with any tax or any regulation has that effect, as what happens at the margins. I think carbon trading gets pretty established in terms of companies and businesses in terms of their carbon trading. The market does have a place in this. I know some years ago, I used to talk about how it was feasible, for example, to have the equivalent of a carbon credit card as a way of trying to individual carbon trading. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that could be done, but it's like each of the things that we talk about, there's also a cost involved in them. And that also what has to be worked through in terms of what's the real cost and what are the rebound effects of everything that we talk about and what then works out best. And it's usually going to be some kind of mixture of measures. I think the individual allowance, personally, I've always found it quite an appealing idea. Being able to implement it in such a way and that it doesn't have huge carbon costs of implementation, I think is going to be the trade-off you have with that, if you know what I mean. I think there is something in it. Fundamentally, I think what we're doing with that is not yet really dealing with the real issue, which is just our consumptive lifestyles. I think ultimately that's what it comes down to, and not really paying for our real impact on this planet. That's the thing which, for me, in terms of my thinking, I keep coming back to with great frustration. What is the lifestyle that we can afford to have without decimating biodiversity anymore, without affecting the landscape anymore, without killing off species anymore? And I think that is the hard question. And I think that the reality is, with current technologies, we can't be so consumptive. Unfortunately, that's the sad answer you come up with. Now, how then do we deal with that? And I'll be quite honest, I realize there are issues with taxes in more ways than one, but polluter pays principle, I think, can be quite a useful way of thinking through this. And I know there's the opposition to this in many countries, particularly from the carbon sector and the coal industry. But what I find remarkable is that there is also a realization that regulation and the imposition of taxes can be extremely innovative because you have to work your way around them. And I find it fascinating looking at the US elections coming up and the ideas behind a Green New Deal. I'm not in favor of everything that's being proposed, but yeah, there's some really sexy stuff there in terms of employment generation, and trying to create some win-win situations, especially now after the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy. And I realize that for many people in some sectors and in the carbon sector, for many of the workers work in the sector. I had several uncles who were coal miners. It's part of your identity, and I get that. But in terms of transitioning, there's still a lot of blue-collar jobs actually getting sustainable infrastructure in place, getting the railway lines back in place and having them working, and reopening some of the lines that used to be open for passenger traffic.
And they're a little more pleasant than coal mining work.
Yeah. My father worked on the railways for years. He laid the railways. That was his job. And so that kind of employment is what a Green New Deal would generate. And it would enable a sustainable phase-out of coal and a lot of the carbon while still generating quality jobs and jobs people can be proud in. To me, some of the opposition I just look at and despair. I think many of the workers in those sectors are partly being misled by some of the owners who don't want to change. And I know some of the stuff I've been thinking of at the moment is about how do we get capital to change? Because that's a problem. We have them already, the technical and many of the behavioral solutions, responses to the problem we have. We have them. We can do it. We have it now. we can become much more sustainable very quickly. The problem is not how to do it. The problem is, will capital and industry not do it? To me, that's the big issue we face. And that gets back to, unfortunately, hardcore politics. It gets back to horrifying lobbying of politicians. And look, we could be talking any country here. I'm not picking on the States at all. But it's those kinds of issues. And workers, in effect, being misled in how to ransom by large businesses who don't want to give up the privileges they've had, or, if we put it another way, they don't want to adapt and change. Some of the coal businesses are the biggest dinosaurs. And it's partly because of how they frame themselves. They frame themselves as being in the business of oil or coal or carbon, not being energy companies. And I think if they reframe themselves differently as being energy companies, the solutions that come up with may well be very different. And for the life of me, I do not understand why they do not do that. Because I think if you're thinking long-term business, it's got to be the way to go, the way of becoming more sustainable and contributing to a more sustainable future and more sustainable mobility. But it is a hell of a challenge.
Right.
So cheerful.
Yes. No, but you know what? I know Dave also appreciates your candidness about these issues. You're not sugarcoating any of it. And that's really what we need. We need more people to get real with us and tell us what the problems are. And, you know, the silver lining to everything that you're saying is that we already have the solutions. They're here. And I guess my question is, even if we did get our act together, what do you have to say about population growth?
I knew that question was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the proverbial twist in the tail. It isn't obviously the size of the population and how it consumes is important. But if you keep having population growth continuing as it has been, then you've got to be back to square one eventually. So I think there has to be ways of trying to limit population. And almost using the word limit almost sounds wrong to me, but when women in particular have access to safe contraception and have choice in their contraception and have received a liberal education, a good education, we know that they'll often choose to have less children. But that also goes hand in hand with what's the employment context, what's the cultural context. It's interesting. I think you can have, when the conditions are right, a transition to lower populations. But the issue is our economy isn't geared to it. I mean, if we're brutally honest, our economy survives on population growth. The economy, as it's usually currently designed, survives on an increasing population of consumers. We have to change the nature of capitalism. Now, before anyone starts accusing me of saying the market's not a good thing, I'm not saying that at all. I think there is a real role for a market, but it's also what surrounds it, and that becomes really important. So therefore, things like having a livable wage and having a welfare system which supplies public health benefits is also part of the sustainable transition equation. And in having a lower rate of population growth, or actually population decline, so you move to a sustainable population level. But that requires infrastructure being placed to enable that. It's all very well for someone to say you should have less children in isolation. It's really hard to do that because you need the other things to go with that to enable people to be able to make that positive choice.
Right.
That requires the rest of the system being there, and lots of countries do not prioritize that. And the problem we've had over the last 30-odd years or so is, this pseudo-market-driven neoliberalism with a smaller role for the state. I can't even use the words I want to describe it in polite company in terms of what absolute crap it is in terms of the distribution of benefits to a wide number of people. If we're looking for that connection between, benefits more broadly, all we've had over the last few years is increasing concentration of growth amongst a smaller number of people who then use their wealth to subvert the political system. And, some people say, what the hell does this have to do with sustainability and tourism? It has everything to do with it because it's a system. Unless, as individual consumers, so much depends on our capacity for choice. Yeah. And like in class, I use myself as an example. I live on a rural property outside of the city where I teach. There used to be public transport here until a few years ago, they got rid of it. I cannot get public transport. I can't get to work. I either have to move where I live or, come up with plan B. It's a system. If you want to have a sustainable transition from mobility, it's the system. Why is the system the way it is in terms of that public transport provision? And it's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in tourism, because I'm interested in thinking of ways, okay, how do we create win-win here? So you have local municipalities and cities saying, oh, we can't afford to do this. And then if you point out to them, well, actually, your local tourists would use it and they'd subsidize it, in effect. Okay, you can create win-wins and develop that public transport infrastructure that people can use. And especially people on lower incomes can potentially use. And they can be mobile, they can be sustainable. But you need to have real systems thinking in terms of being able to do that, in terms of urban design, transport design. How is the local economy structured? And, and fundamentally, in terms of what we're talking about, look, we have to deal with the system. If we want a sustainable future, we have to deal with the system. There's no two ways around it. We cannot avoid it. We just cannot go on with piecemeal responses. And I think the notion of a Green New Deal is potentially, if I think of not just the States, but other countries who would think about the same thing, can be part of that transition. But it means having the political will to include all parts of the economy in it, to start steering the economy in that transition. And what I'm advocating for, what others advocate for, doesn't lower your quality of life. And in fact, I actually think it probably improves it. But it means having a more inclusive economy, which is geared towards sustainability, generally geared towards sustainability. And that's what we don't have now in so many countries. Hence my frustration.
Well, Michael Hall, we so appreciate the depth and breadth of your knowledge. The downside of this is that I think we're going to need about another 9 episodes to fully mine that. There's just so much that we haven't gotten into, but I think I'm going to have to be the bad cop and say we should stop for this episode and reconvene soon to get into other matters.
Anytime, Dave.
You good for that, Erika, too?
Definitely.
Okay. That was probably as good a wrap-up as you could give, but if there's any final thought that you'd like to leave our listeners with, we'll definitely give you the last word.
Yeah, I think so many things those things we've been talking about, they are all useful things to do, but fundamentally, we've got to deal with the system and the structure. Unless we deal with that, we are, I hate to use the word doomed, it sounds so negative, but I think we're just making the problem worse for ourselves. I think that's what I find so frustrating, is that it doesn't need to be like this. It's not radical. It isn't radical. It's been done before. I think it's just being able to respond in such a way like, hey, we've got a problem. We've got the capacity to solve it. We need to change some things in our structure. What it will mean is some people will be better off. I think that's a good thing. And I think it's economically sensible, especially in response to COVID-19, trying to be more sustainable in our business practices. And obviously it's good for the planet. And I know that America is dealing with this problem at the moment in terms of the current election, is how do we achieve this? And in particular, how do we convince people who for various reasons do not want to go down that path? How do we take them on the journey and make them part of the coalition we need to actually have a more sustainable future? And I think that's the real challenge.
Well, I've got the solution to that, so you'll be glad to hear that. We just need to pack up the United States. Everybody just send them on an ecotourism trip to the planet Xenon, and then the world will have a chance.
Book me in.
So we've got this segment at the end where it's called Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint. and we each share something we do that we think is just noteworthy or quirky or entertaining or that we're really proud of that we do to shrink our footprint. And sometimes we try to really surprise each other with something the other people wouldn't have thought of, or sometimes it's really obvious. No rules. We each share one thing that we have done recently or that we kind of incorporated into our lives to be a better citizen of planet Earth. And I'll start to give you a good example. I am a religious zealot when it comes to bottled water. I absolutely refuse to ever consume water, out of a single-use plastic bottle that got shipped halfway around the world. And when you travel, when you think about it, those bottles are constantly being pushed at you, and even on the airplanes half the time, more than half the time, the water is being poured out of plastic bottles where that water didn't come out of the tap. When you get to local transportation, the first thing they do is hand you a bottle of water. You get into your hotel room, there's a couple of bottles of water on the desk, and there's everything to support and encourage you to keep on drinking those bottles of water. And of course, there's some places in the world where you probably better drink the water out of those bottles rather than the local tap water. Mm-hmm. I just never go anywhere without my reusable water bottle, and it goes double when I'm going on a trip because that way I don't have to accept that bottled water. I have a little bit of a choice about where the water comes from that goes into that bottle, and I'm not constantly throwing away or recycling or hoping to recycle plastic bottles. That's my footprint shrinking thing.
Awesome. Michael, you want to go next or should I go?
Well, I went to the market on the weekend and I bought myself a couple of new second-hand jumpers. I try and reuse and recycle as much as possible. One of the things I do, we have a small farm, so we try and grow as much as we possibly can ourselves. It's kind of interesting because it also means I get to kill what I grow. And it's a tricky one. I know people don't necessarily like the idea, but I know the meat we have and we know where it comes from. I mean, to me, that's something which is just really important for me in terms of being able to cut down my emissions, is being able to have as much as what we can grow as possible. But I tend to be a real, as you're saying, a zealot about this wherever I go, of really, really wanting to eat local, no matter what it is, because I think it's such an important part of learning about a place and talking with local people. So I always usually head for the nearest market. Wherever I go, I head for the market.
Well, that takes some guts, but you definitely get rewarded. But you said you go to the market and pick up a couple of jumpers. What's a jumper?
Oh, a jumper. Sorry, guys. Translation time. We could talk about bathing costumes because it's like, are they costumes? Are they swimmers? Are they bathers? What are they? A jumper is like a pullover, a sweater. Does that make sense?
Oh.
Okay. Yeah. So
it doesn't make sense to call it a jumper.
Well, it comes from a woolly jumper, so they're all wool. And I assume, I've never looked it up, I assume it comes from the fact that sheep jump. I have no idea. I have no idea. Yeah, so yeah, I'm pretty proud of myself because I always try and, especially these days, I try and buy local stuff, which is actually clothes-wise, don't know how you find it. I think it's easier in the States, but in New Zealand now, it's a really hard challenge to find something that's been locally made. Everything's otherwise imported from China or India.
Yeah, same thing, Tara. Well, you're in New Zealand, but our listeners may have figured it out. If they hadn't, you're an Aussie. And, well, actually, Kiwis and Aussies have the most amazing slang and funniest names for everything. I'm surprised we haven't had more laughs about that during this conversation.
I've been trying to be good at using my international English.
Yep, you have. All right, Erika, you're up.
All right, so by the time this episode is published, I will be going on 2 months living car-free in California, which...
Amazing.
That's impressive.
Hooray.
Right? I think it's kind of a big deal. The motivation behind selling my car back in June was to afford to live on a graduate student budget. And thanks to COVID, I really don't have to drive anywhere anymore. So it's kind of nice. It's definitely working for me. If I have to go to a market, I have roommates that can take me to the market, or I could always Uber if there's no one here, but it's been really working out great. So I'm a little proud of myself.
Way to go. And in Southern California, no less.
I know, right?
They've got streets there so wide that, it takes you about 3 days to cross the street. So it's just not designed for pedestrians.
I'm at least 4 miles away from the nearest anything.
That is impressive. Actually, that reminds me of a story. Years ago, I was in Sheffield in the UK, and they were putting in a new light rail system, like a tram line. And I took a picture of it. I was so astounded. They were digging up the road, and what were they digging up? They were digging up the tram lines that were there from 50 years earlier, which they had just tarmacked and bituminized over. Yeah. And it's like, I sometimes think, because I grew up in a car-free household as a kid, and I sometimes think that all we're doing is, in some ways, is going back to what we used to do.
Right.
You know?
In some ways,
We
yeah.
never used to have so many cars. We had a bike.
Yep, there you go.
And we never used to think anything of it. I don't know. It's one of those things that always just strikes me about how, it depends how we grew up, of course. So when I was a kid, we didn't really even have a phone. We weren't that poor, but, phones were relatively novel. Maybe I'm showing my age. We didn't have a car. You used to walk everywhere, go by bike or get a bus. And that was the norm. And I kind of think we're in a period of huge consumptive mobility or something, which we kind of need to get out of in terms of our thinking. Maybe it's a temporary aberration. Maybe I'm just being hopeful.
No, I love that you said that, because it's very true, Michael. You really don't know what is possible. You really don't know what you're capable of doing until you take it away. And, you could apply that concept to anything. Diet comes to mind. If you are trying to give up on the sweets, Dad, I'm talking to you. Mom, I'm talking to you too. If you're trying to give up those sweets, take out all of the sugar from the house. You think it's going to be hard. You're looking at it as a major sacrifice and, a loss to your happiness. But it's going to be better. You're more than capable of living without everything that you think you need to have in your life on a daily basis. So the car, I didn't think I would be able to do it. I thought, gosh, I'm going to give this a week and this is not going to be possible for me. I live in SoCal, but honestly, it's been great. I have zero motivation to even purchase a car at this point. I don't know if I ever will, even if it's electric.
Very cool. All right. Next, you'll have to move to the farm.
Right?
Yeah.
Michael, thanks again so much, because it's really been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks again. Talk to you again sometime.
That was Dr. Michael Hall, professor in the Department of Management, Marketing, and Entrepreneurship at University of Canterbury in New Zealand.
What a conversation.
Yeah, what a very pleasant and really thoughtful fellow. I really enjoyed.
Same. I mean, when we reached out to him, I knew he would be the perfect fellow for this episode, but blew my mind.
Yeah, but because our mobility is such a huge part of our carbon footprint, I really think there's a lot of fertile ground yet for us to cover. Would you agree?
I would.
So we've agreed that we're going to do at least 2 more episodes just about greening the way we get around, and that's not counting any that we might dream up to bring Dr. Hall back.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. We seem to stop at a really good place in the conversation, but it sounds like he has a lot of other ideas that we can talk about.
Yeah.
I brought up population, which we don't normally do on this podcast, but I really appreciate Michael for sharing what he thinks about it, and also just kind of being on the same page with us about how our individual actions really do make an impact, but that's not the whole...
It's not the whole enchilada.
It's not the whole enchilada. Systemic change is also important, and we also need to have resources in place and things that make it possible to empower people to make these smarter choices. So things like healthcare and education and more equality in the world.
Yeah, I got kind of a kick out of the fact that he was expecting to be asked about population, because we do bring it up from time to time, so he was ready for that. And interestingly, Erika, I've been doing a ton of research for the next travel episode and just discovered that there are people who are doing studies and really serious data analysis, and they're starting to distinguish between lifestyle actions and the actions of the system. They're differentiating between them. And I think that only good can come from that, because at least they're acknowledging that, there are some things that we can do. And of course, I'm going to always preach that one of the only ways we have in our hands to easily change the system is to really vote with our pocketbooks and be a customer of the good people out there doing the right thing, and stop being a customer of the people out there who are destroying the planet.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great one. And I don't think we talked enough about that with Michael, but I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, so we'll definitely have some things to bring him back for. We could do an episode a day.
I really like his idea about getting tourists to subsidize public transportation. Yeah, we definitely need something like that here in California, where I'm making it work without a car, but that's not the majority of people here. I get looks on the street when I'm walking 4 or 5 miles going to the market. It's just not the norm.
Got to get you a bicycle. Yeah, I think the kind of work he does makes him come up with these market solutions, which I think are pretty cool. And there was one other thing he mentioned that I kind of made a mental note about, and that was he said that we're in an era of consumptive mobility. So we need to move into the next era of non-consumptive mobility somehow.
Yeah. He's not saying there's not a market. There's a market. It's just capitalism that's really destroying us. And there's limits.
Yeah. But we can design market interventions to steer the market in better directions.
Right. And to better support the citizens.
Sure thing. All right. Well, that wraps up another fine edition of Growth Busters. Erika, Arias, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's always great to have your sense of humor, your perspective, and you find us great guests. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
If you like what you've heard and you haven't been listening to every episode, you can find many more episodes of the Growth Busters podcast at growthbusters.org. You can search Growth Busters on any podcast app and find us. You can tell most smart speakers to play the Growth Busters podcast and you'll get us. So we encourage you to subscribe. We encourage you to tell your friends about it, because we need to inspire everyone around the world to live more sustainably.
I'm Erika Arias, reminding you that friends don't let friends miss the real story on sustainable living. Thanks so much for listening.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.